everyone, and then we will go ahead and introduce Zoe.
Arizona is home to 22 indigenous tribes.
Arizona State University's campuses are situated on the homelands of many tribal nations,
in particular the O'odham
and Peepash, and acknowledge the many indigenous communities who reside in this territory.
Skigik is the O'odham word that is now known as Phoenix, which was settled in 1881 by occupiers.
The ancestors of the O'odham, the Huhugam, created canals and utilized surrounding rivers that are the basis of the current irrigation system that feeds Skigik today.
These waterways have always been the foundation and livelihood of the residents within the valley. Throughout the past 500 years, the impact of colonialism have been detrimental to indigenous lands and languages, affecting their livelihood.
Many people who live in the Southwest are unaware of this history. Furthermore, ASU's indigenous student community consists of over 3,000 strong,
not including faculty, staff, and alumni who continue to thrive, educate, and advocate for the strengthening of indigenous ways of life.
As the O'odham call it, Himdak, the way of life for the O'odham, encompassing their culture, traditions, identity, and being. As O'odham and indigenous peoples,
our identity is tied to the land. Like our own bodies, we must respect and care for it, and we urge everyone to do the same.
We challenge you to educate yourself about the history and the communities who continue to thrive today.
Moving forward, it is vital to honor and respect
that you are always
on indigenous land.
All right. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Zoe. One second, sorry. All right. So, Zoe is a Mexican-Venezuelan new media artist, filmmaker, and producer who specializes in interactive storytelling experiences. Their work spans live entertainment, performance, immersive installations, mixed reality, and emerging technologies. Zoe's practice is influenced by themes of diaspora, nostalgia, ritual, and magical realism. Zoe received an MFA from UC Santa Cruz in digital arts and new media and is currently lecturing at UCSC's Arts, Games, and Playable Media program. Zoe recently co-founded creative engineering studio Pseudomagic that helps design firms bring their ideas to life. And go ahead and take it away, Zoe. Thank you very much.
Hello, hello. So I'm hoping you can see my screen. Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe. Hello to all of you across this digital sphere that we're in. Thank you to ASU for having me and hosting me. So as Xavier said, my name is Zoe. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm here to talk to you all about magic and meaning making and the alchemy of new media. But first off, I want to say that I'm calling from the greater Los Angeles area, the unceded territory of the Chumash, Tongva, and Gabrielino peoples. So today I'll be telling you all basically a story about my experiences with emerging technologies, and we'll be giving a case study and a look behind the curtain of Apprentice at the End of the World, which you can see here. It was an ambulatory theatrical production at UCLA, and I'm gonna basically give you a behind the scenes look of that. But before I do that, I wanted to give you a bit of a background of who I am. I wear many hats, like probably many of you out there. I'm an artist, a producer, a creative programmer. I'm an educator, all of these things, you name it. I've probably tried it. I'm Mexican Venezuelan, and a lot of my work and my practice is influenced by themes of nostalgia, of growing up in the Caribbean, my memories, and diaspora. And if you can't tell by this / like my background, my aesthetic is very fantastical, colorful, playful, and magically real. I primarily make interactive installations that explore audience engagement and play. Here you see Reflected Refracted, which was an installation where I invited participants to move through an RGB color space, where their physical movements within the space changed the lighting in the room. And I used a markered motion tracking system. So folks wore this little wristlet that had a little emitter. And so there was a tracking system in the space. And I mapped the positions of this tracker against the mathematics and the color space of an RGB cube so that you could dynamically control the lighting of the space for yourself and those around you. My installations often act as playful interventions in educational settings and in gallery spaces. They're an opportunity for folks to engage in more than just spectatorship. With this piece, the Wellness Wonder Cabinet, I invited gallery attendees to share personal, wonderful reflections, random reflections, and place them in this illuminated, curious cabinet for others to read. I also integrate mechanics of game design and play with ritual and ritualized actions in my work. Divinación en Migración was an encounter with this living mediated oracle deck, a deck that was primarily inspired by my family's immigration to the United States, that reflects specifically on my dad's travels here and his path to citizenship. This reflective participatory work that I've just shown you is work that was done during my master's at UC Santa Cruz and was centered around this notion of experimental play and playable media and experimental forms of working with new media. Play, in this sense, when I talk about play, comes from the work of the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga. Primarily their assertion that play, engagement, and participation are essential for the generation and the growth of culture. Play is an opportunity for us to commune, to share personal experience, to be playful, and to be joyous. And a lot of my work and a lot of the spaces that I create are sites where attendees can be transported to other worlds where new forms of play are possible and where new rituals can exist. Largely, like you can see in this space, which is an immersive installation environment. So I really like, I both like work and like creating work that are imbued with magical realism, that are slightly otherworldly, that allow for the suspension of disbelief. Places that are distinctly part of this world, but also apart from this world. I often think of these spaces as portals. They're sacred spaces, spaces that act as places of research, places of worship, and places for play. All places that can be vehicles for collective storytelling. Theater is a ritualistic space, a sacred space where we tell, gather, and share stories. The theater is a site of great power and potential where we go to watch stories unfold. I came to this kind of work, this sort of performative, theatrical, participatory work in somewhat of a roundabout way. I was never a theater kid per se. I was really consumed in books on magical realism and films like Pan's Labyrinth. And so way back when, I did my undergrad at UCLA and studied filmmaking. And during that time, I was fortunate enough to explore the possibilities of new media and emerging technologies. I was thankfully part of the last class to shoot 16mm film. And I think that, that is an invaluable experience that I will always cherish just because of the nature of film and the power of film as a medium. But I was also the first class to form a new concentration or kind of a new focus as part of my major in experimental forms of documentary. While at UCLA, I participated in this class called Location-Based Audience-Aware Storytelling. It was part of the Google Glass Collective back when Google Glass was a thing, and I produced a series of interactive storytelling experiences. The one on the right, where you see folks kind of around a chessboard, chess, yes, I was going to say checkers, no, a chessboard, was a live action role playing experience, a LARP, where participants were invited to role play as characters in this clue style murder mystery. And they were fed information about their characters in real time via Google Glass. And so they learned about their characters, they were given clues about what to uncover via Glass. All of this work was supported and mediated by the UCLA Center for Research in Engineering, Media, and Performance, also known as REMAP. REMAP is a research lab that is situated kind of between the School of Theater, Film, and Television and the School of Engineering. So really an kind of interdisciplinary lab where there are folks from both worlds working together to create these interactive experiences. And REMAP was my first introduction into experimental playable media. UCLA REMAP has a long history of creating these theatrical experiences, from main stage shows to new media installation. Their work largely focuses on researching new ways to integrate cutting edge technology with storytelling experiences. I worked at REMAP after I graduated my undergrad, first as a production coordinator and then later as a project manager for their research efforts at the time. And my first project, post undergrad, was the Future of Storytelling Summer Institute. And this was the basis for Apprentice at the End of the World, which I'm going to talk to you about in a little bit. But this was basically a summer intensive workshop where students in acting, but acting from the theatrical side, worked together with students from film production to explore new approaches for virtual production and the role of virtual production in a live performance environment. So here we see on the left, there was an actor and a dancer set on a large green screen stage with a camera, and we were doing live compositing, and we actually held a show in this green screen space. And we were largely exploring techniques used in broadcast television systems, in markerless motion capture, and in camera calibration systems used in television broadcast. Like much of REMAP's previous work, we were exploring the potential for interdisciplinary collaboration, as well as the role of technology within a rehearsal environment. So thinking about how we can use technology really early on in productions and projects so that it's not added on a little bit too late in the process. And although these kinds of technologies are more often seen in film and gaming production pipelines, theater actually really, I feel like, has been the epicenter for a lot of this exploration of new technologies. I think we often think of maybe the sciences as well as being the epicenter of technology and innovation, but I really like to challenge folks to think differently and to see theater as one of those places and sites for that innovation. From perspective scenery in the 16th century to Pepper's Ghost in the 1800s to the Laterna Magica Theater, which is what some consider to be the world's first multimedia production, the arts and the world of theater has long been a site for experimentation of play, of media, and technology, and a site for the suspension of disbelief and the embracing of the unknown and the possibilities of the unknown. So enter now, with this context, Apprentice at the End of the World. I will set the scene. You find yourself in a post-apocalyptic environment, migrating, moving, shifting to uncover forgotten lore, in a world that's both old and new, mediated by magic and technology. So Apprentice at the End of the World was an ambulatory theater production devised during a 3-week summer intensive with the students and staff from UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television. And we were primarily exploring the role of augmented reality technology for social impact storytelling. So for storytelling about real stories and about stories from folks who are underserved and underrepresented and trying to uplift and share stories using new technologies. My role as a creative producer was both leading the production from the design side of things. So the set design, scenic design, costume design, helping steward those folks and including media design and projection design. But it was also managing the software development team that helped create the mobile application for this. And the goal that I was tasked with, or the effort that I was tasked with, was integrating both the physical world of Apprentice at the End of the World and the virtual and digital world that was seen through the mobile devices that were used during the experience. So this piece was adapted from N.K. Jemison's The Fifth Season. This is the first book in the sci-fi fantasy Broken Earth trilogy series. It tells the story of the people of the Stillness and their perils in the face of a climate apocalypse, which feels like we're all facing now, and their struggle for existence in a dying world. And not only that, but also their revolution against colorism, racism, and oppression, and the oppressive forces in the stillness. So Apprentice at the End of the World was both an exercise in exploring these storytelling techniques, but also uplifting the stories of artists of color, honoring and sharing their perspectives with our work. I highly recommend that you read this book series if you like sci-fi fantasy. I love these books so much, cannot recommend them enough. So it's important to note that this experience was actually not a main stage production, but rather a series of educational and experimental exercises that were focused more so on research. During the course of the summer workshop, we hosted 10 open rehearsals where we invited friends and family to kind of explore the work that we had been putting up and doing. So prior to entering the space, folks were invited to read about the materials and what we were investigating and to get a bit of context for what they were going to experience. And this was set at UCLA's Froude Playhouse. So I'll sprinkle some of these research questions in my talk because I think they were helpful and valuable for us to explore the role of augmented reality in theater and live performance, but I'll also read them to you here. So some of our questions asked, which elements of a story are most effective in terms of audience engagement and enjoyment when implemented in the physical world or a physical environment, in projection and media, in AR delivered to the audience's device or in the AR? And how can we manage or control attention across these many screens? To give you a sense of the audience flow for this experience, so folks walked up from the side of the theater onto the apron. So they weren't actually sitting in the seats. Folks were walking and moving around in this space and then onto the stage of the theater. And there was a really crucial onboarding experience that was part of this introduction. Similar to how a tutorial works at the beginning of a game. I think that's essential when you're working with new technologies. Like, how can we convey the necessary information for how to use this device? So audience members at the beginning in this onboarding were handed staffs, these kind of like sticks here, with mobile devices that were loaded with the show's AR application. And in addition to kind of this moment where they're learning how to use this technology, they were face-to-face with the characters of the stillness. And this technique is similar to what you see with cast members, kind of like in a theme park or location-based storytelling experiences and entertainment as a way to kind of set the scene here. And of course, we had a Dark Forces crew that hid in the shadows, but also acted as tech support for attendees as needed. Such as I think the nature of working with new technologies, it's helpful and important to be able to have this kind of support, especially with experimental technology. And during this antechamber onboarding, we also introduced the audience to ritualized movements that they could use to unlock media and narrative on their device throughout the experience. So what they learned here was really the rules of engagement and how to kind of uncover things within the space. So here you see audience members pointing the staff downwards. And what you can't see in the frame, but you kind of can see in the screen of the device, is a symbol. And so these Loric symbols were on the floor throughout the installation or throughout the experience. And they basically unlocked narrative information throughout the experience. You can kind of think of these as QR codes or fiducial markers. And that was just a way for us to be able to trigger content on the fly. And really, it allowed audience members to see the AR elements. That was the main purpose, to unlock the story, the narrative, the magic of the stillness. Here you can see an amethyst obelisk floating in the sky. This moved and guided them throughout the rest of their experience. And so they could intermittently look for the obelisk throughout the experience. Another one of our research questions was, how do we maintain the magic of the world that we're creating when using new technology? And how can the use of AR technology become part of the performance ritual rather than being intrusive? And how can AR be imbued with significance from the outset based on the ways that we use devices in the real world? How can we leverage that understanding so that it feels natural in a performance experience or in a theatrical production? And so we decided early on to have our phones in portrait mode rather than in landscape mode. There was a lot of conversations about that, and I do think there are different camps there, but we did decide to keep it in one view, have it on a staff so that people wouldn't have to be like holding their arms up the whole time to have that kind of support. Once folks were kind of onboarded with their devices, they walked onto the stage and were split into 2 different groups. And while they were in these groups, they learned new actions, uncovered new story information, and we had a lot of questions ourselves of, how distracting is it to have a device in a performance atmosphere where you're supposed to be, maybe potentially looking at something happening on stage. I feel like we often negotiate our relationship to staring at screens so much, especially now. But, how do you kind of mediate the attention? We definitely used lighting and kind of use traditional storytelling techniques in theater to be able to help guide attention in the space. So, rather than there being something on the phones that says, look up, instead we drastically changed the environment around the participants so that they were guided where to look. I think often take for granted how convenient it is to be in the same physical space, maybe especially now, with this complexity of being online and having to host online events or anything that's brokered by a screen. You run into so many issues of navigating time zones, platforms, operating systems, synchronization, lag, you name it. And those complications that we're seeing more today in this Zoomified universe is also very present in mediated experiences using mobile devices, right? How can we make sure, this was a big challenge for us, that everyone sees the same thing on their mobile device at the same time, so that we can ensure that the experience stays cohesive for everyone, and so that things don't get out of sync, or there's technical issues that kind of pull you out of a given experience. Crafting this shared experience, I think, we can look to game design and multiplayer games for the best approaches for how to have that necessary synchronization across devices. And, another important note here is, along with, having something that potentially is multiplayer or that you're expecting that multiple people are engaging in, is, how does the phone know what to look at, and how does it know where to place objects in a physical environment? And so, converging the physical and digital worlds for this production was largely similar to an alignment and synchronization process, like you see in AR games like Ingress or Pokemon Go. The synchronization of the digital and physical world was really essential. And here you can kind of see it on the devices, probably even smaller for you. It's because it's on tiny screens. But it was really important for us. This was, I think, one of our biggest hurdles and one of our kind of biggest milestones to achieve, to make sure that everything felt cohesive. Otherwise, the illusion of the experience would be broken. And here you can see, this was a screenshot of like what it looked like on the phones. And we allowed, we enabled a multiplayer setting so that if someone did something on their phone, other people could see it at the same time. And that was really essential for the experience to feel seamless. So a look further behind the curtain, I, as a producer and pragmatist, like sharing the tools that we use so that other folks who are interested in creating these kinds of experiences also have that information for themselves. So we used an AR application. So the AR application that we built was made for Android devices and built as a multiplayer game in Unity, and used AR Core for its augmented reality feature detection. And building an AR app during the production required, an iterative development cycle of prototyping and testing that you usually see more in the software side of development. So a really agile and iterative process that kind of happened in parallel to the devising of a script and the overall theatrical experience. During this process, we learned that very important thing, that the calibration and plane detection system, which is the way that the world, the virtual world, calibrates itself to the real world, does not like the obscureness of a black box theater or of a theater space, largely because it's dark floors, dark walls. The device has a hard time, and the system has a hard time telling the difference between the floor and the walls. And if it doesn't know where the floors and the walls are, it will put your AR elements just floating in space and not where they're supposed to go. And so that required a lot of refinement and development on our end, but also required that we took a scenic approach and textured the floor. So we ended up actually having to paint the floor and spray it with this kind of sprinkled texture. I think we did 2 passes to be able to add enough texture on the floor so that the phone could properly detect the plane of the floor and place the objects. And here you can actually see some of the custom fiducial markers that we made for this process, also to be able to kind of trigger that AR content. So because this was a research endeavor and not a full-fledged production, we were able to get audience feedback and do downloads with them after they did their rehearsal runs. And it was really helpful to talk with them because we learned that they enjoyed the narratives and the performance, but they did indeed feel disoriented when first using the technology, despite having an onboarding. And they were unsure about when they should be looking at their phones or at the performance. And so that was something we were worried about. It was true, and was something that we kind of took away from this. Additionally, what was, I think a positive thing was that they would have liked more time to explore and unlock the aloric symbols in the space. And the overall experience was only 30 minutes, and mostly so that we could do several runs and kind of do testing. But it was nice to hear that folks wanted to explore more and would have liked more time, if possible, to explore the space. I'm going to take a sip of water. And then technology for the sake of technology. So this project was part of an AR research funding, a grant funding. And so as part of a grant funding, there was the kind of requirement to explore augmented reality technologies in this context. But as is the nature of working with emerging technologies, you start to consider what other ancillary technologies you can use in conjunction with it to heighten the experience, if you will. And there was the consideration of using a sort of motion tracking system so that we would be able to track participants' movement in the space. But early on, we asked ourselves a really important question. Does it serve the piece? And I feel like this is a question that I often come back to and is such an important question when making creative work and working with emerging and new technologies, is to think, does it serve the piece? Will it support the experience that we are trying to create? And with this motion tracking system that we were thinking about incorporating, the answer was no. We were like, this actually doesn't serve the nature of the work we're trying to do, so we're going to cut it. And I share this case study of Apprentice at the End of the World because it wasn't a research context, and I feel like we got to ask a lot of interesting questions, and I think the behind the scenes was interesting, but I also wanted to share it because it really informed my own personal research at the time. So as I shared early on in this talk, the work that I had shown up until this was part of my master's research. And Apprentice at the End of the World happened right before my senior year in my MFA. And so I came back from the summer of doing this show, and I was left with this question about technology. And do we sometimes just use technology for the sake of having the new technology? What is the newness of new media? And can it sometimes be this like vortex hole of just desire? And so I was making this piece, but I didn't know that it would be this piece. So Remnants of a Ritual was my master's thesis installation. That was this immersive dream space where I was sharing my personal reflections on Venezuela and a family archive. And when I came back from the summer, I was navigating the archive of photographs my grandfather had taken of Venezuela and ruminating about how I was going to integrate them in my technographic practice of working with digital media and working with motion sensing and working with all of these technologies, working with such kind of ephemeral pieces and snapshots of Venezuela and my imaginations for my thesis. And in this process, I began experimenting with post-processing techniques. I was doing a lot of different things. And eventually I ended in a process that I really love and I'm really happy with now. So I was exploring machine learning and computer vision techniques to reimagine these photos of Venezuela, because in looking at the black and white images, they were largely black and white, only some of them were color. I was really reminded of Venezuela that I remembered from my childhood, and I wanted my MFA and my thesis to show that Venezuela that I remembered, which is so different from the Venezuela of today. And so by using style transfer, so the process of applying the style of the sort of kind of your model, which for here was on the left a YU tapestry, to the photograph, I was able to create this transferred image, which was kind of fantastical and magical. And so I was doing a lot of these machine learning experiments and, like doing a sort of alchemy. It really is what it felt like, trying to transmute my anxieties of Venezuela. And at the same time, I was like, okay, but what is the space going to be like? I'm producing this installation and this experience. And I'm like, I was still stuck on, what technologies was I going to use? And as a way to kind of navigate, I think, my stress of making, I started a series of folding practices. So kind of like origami, but I was folding money, that Venezuelan money, bolivares, that my aunt had brought with her in her exile that was valueless. Like, because of the inflation rate of the currency, it was valueless. And I started to, rather than focus on emerging technologies, I was focusing on process art and practice and materiality and ritual, and this process of transformation and alchemy, that to me felt more intertwined with my kind of desires and reflections for the piece, which is about alchemy and about, sharing this vision that I had of Venezuela. And this grew into this process of crystallization, where I was actually crystallizing money and crystallizing film, and really felt like these novel experiments that were completely like separated from digital technologies that at the time, up until that point, I had been working with so much. And I think that's probably why it felt so magical and sacred to me, was because I was taking a step away from being with machines. And I invited other people into this process of discovery that I was kind of uncovering in the development of my MFA, specifically this act of writing. So I had come back from the summer, all of these thoughts were happening about what technology to use for my thesis. And I just went back to, well, what was the most effective form of audience engagement up until that point that I had done or had created? And the act of writing was the lowest barrier to entry for participants coming to my installations. Like, so many people knew, okay, respond to a prompt. That was really easy for folks to participate in. And so I invited students from UC Santa Cruz to share their stories of places that they could no longer return to. Like, I could no longer return to the Venezuela of my memories. I invited them to share their own experiences. And so they would write them on this vellum, and I kind of crystallized these letters and formed them into this sculpture. So I took a completely different approach. I went into a more fine arts route, I think, for my MFA. And I created this sculpture, and I focused instead on that ritual process. And so I think what's really interesting is that the Summer Institute, that technology for the sake of technology, really helped me refine my own process of, what is it that I'm making, and am I chasing something just because it's this unicorn? And instead, what am I trying to convey with the piece? Does it serve the piece? And so I cut any additional technology that I was thinking about adding, and instead focus on the interactive portions of having and inviting folks to write love letters, as this installation was for myself, which was a love letter to Venezuela. And in the end, I'm really happy and thankful that I didn't, add also a motion tracking system, or who knows what it could have been. But I'll leave you with this quote. At the center of my work, I frequently come back to our relationship to play and to playfulness. And play is really, I think, the mediator of the invisible and the visible. And I love this quote from Dora M. Kulf. Dora is, or Dr. Kulf, sorry, is a Jungian psychologist who devised this theory of and this practice of sand play. And so it's a form of therapy where you play with sand and you move objects to express yourself and like create these worlds. And I think it's really valuable how much play and interactivity that we can generate sometimes, or especially without digital technologies. And it's really, it feels almost surreal for me to say that, just because of the nature of my work up until now. But, you know, play is in everything that we do. And I think is a serious facilitator of creativity and change. And I really encourage all of you out there to encourage you to be more open, I guess, with your practices and your processes in the work that you create. Because sometimes it'll turn out it'll usually, I think, turn out completely, maybe in ways that you didn't expect. And I think that's amazing. And to let yourself be open with that process, just as I was with my own thesis installation. So yeah, that's it. That's what I have for you. Thank you so much to all of you here and there digitally. And this is who I am. Yeah. The awkward ending, you know.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Zoe. That was an amazing talk. And I know I myself will definitely be kind of taking your advice of trying to take a step back a little bit. But does anybody in the Zoom or in the YouTube chat have any questions that they would like to share with Zoe? I'm just waiting for the the YouTube to catch up to where we are currently. I'll go ahead and get us going just so we can take some time for anybody that might want to ask questions. So in your practice, I imagine you use a lot of different tools. And of course, when it comes to selecting like which one am I going to use for X project, it's kind of dependent on A, what you're doing, and B, what you're comfortable with. Are there tools that you kind of find yourself always coming back to in terms of kind of any project you're doing that you have a heavy reliance on? And if so, what about that tool makes it so versatile or so helpful for you that you want to come back to it every time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tried to be tool agnostic, but just because I do like being open to the possibilities of, you know, what another tool could offer. That's always a slippery slope, though. And so the tools that I come back to the most, I think, are, strangely enough, Illustrator is such a useful tool. And I really love it just because SVGs and the scalability of an SVG and the possibilities that Illustrator has are great. And the other tool for thinking about creating interactive systems is Touch Designer, which is a visual-based programming language. And as a person who came to this kind of work with a filmmaking background, not necessarily a programming background, it's been really helpful for me to create these state machines and interactive systems and program them in a visual way so I can see what's happening and not necessarily just have to write it all by hand with code.
That's great. I am not seeing anything in the YouTube. Does anyone in the Zoom call have any questions that they'd like to ask? Okay. Well, if there's no questions, then I will go ahead and thank everyone for coming. We look forward to seeing you all next week for our next speaker series. Thank you, everyone.